Greetings and welcome back to the channel, World War II Books Where to Start. I'm your host, Chuichi Nagumo, formerly commander of Kido Butai, and these days I'm semi-retired on a hot island in the Central Pacific, and with some extra time on my hands, I thought I'd relate a story of a few books, all involving Japan, that I've recently read and tell you what I think of them. Japan isn't the only thing tying these things together, though. There's a fair dose of China involved as well. You know China, the country we tried to conquer first, and then when that didn't work out, we went after every piece of real estate in the Pacific Ocean. Which reminds me also of the Third Reich's logic that since they can't invade Britain to get them out of the war, Germany will instead invade the Soviet Union, and that will make Britain surrender eventually after the Soviets concede. Well, perhaps neither idea was all that bright, really, but there's still time. The jury's still out. Nothing's been decided yet. It's only 44. And so in the meantime, we'll do some reading. And with that, let's hit the books. All right, and first up today, we have An Impeccable Spy by O.M. Matthews from 2019, 351 pages, main body. I first tried to read Prang's book on Richard Zorga. It's called Target Tokyo last year, but I found it rather sedate and meandering, and honestly quite dull when I didn't get through the audio, and maybe when I have to read in print in order to get through it. So I put that aside, and I found this bio on a man who is certainly ranked in the top 5 of most effective spies of the war, if there's anything like an official ranking for that sort of thing. I mean, it's all deeply subjective what an effective spy might mean, but I suppose you could come up with categories like length of undercover operation, amount of information gleaned, importance of that information, reliability thereof, how many other agents they recruited, and what those agents' successes were, how many agents of that ringleader were caught, and did the ringleader himself / herself get caught, and if so, what tale did they tell when they were under duress? In such an analysis, Zorga stands apart. A devoted German communist from an early age after serving in the German army in the Great War and being wounded 3 times, yikes, once on the Western Front and twice on the Eastern, with some of his fingertips so mangled they had to be amputated, he takes up the unrewarding task of recruiting other communists in post-war Germany and drifts into espionage from there, finding he's got a bit of a gift for it. Sent to Moscow for training, then uses some small operations in Europe and Scandinavia, and even once arrested in England on charges unrelated to spying. Distrusted within the Soviet intelligence apparatus, of course, because he's German, his handler moves him on to China, where he will meet both Agnes Smedley and Ursula Kozinski, aka Agent Sonia, and where he will have affairs with both women. Ursula may be married, but that hardly matters when you get quite a charming man with a motorcycle and a devil-may-care attitude towards life. Zorga builds up his spy ring in China, often using Ursula's house as a meeting point, much to the dismay of her and her husband. Mixed in with this excitement, he also had the time to marry twice. The second time to a Russian woman named, of course, Katya, whom he leaves behind in Russia quite willingly, professing true love and endless devotion. In reality, he hardly cares. He's a zealot working for the cause and quite heartless. After a few years of spy work in China, he's recalled to the Soviet Union but doesn't get purged. In Germany, he manages to pose as a journalist and applies for membership to the Nazi Party, despite being on file as having been in the Communist Party way back when. Somehow his application gets approved, which leads to conjecture that someone already in the NSDAP who was vetting new apps may have paved the way for Zorga, but we'll never know. This puts him in the unique category of being a member of both the Communist and Nazi parties at the same time. He has some sojourns in New York City and back to Moscow, blah, 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 and eventually he's dispatched to Japan for his toughest assignment. Still operating as a journalist for an agricultural magazine, he tries as best he can to blend into the mere 8,000 foreigners in Japan at the time, and of those 8,000, 1,000 were Germans. So you can say everybody kind of knows everybody. He cozies up to the embassy staff, first with the ambassador Dirksen, and then the military attaché Eugen Ott, who will eventually become ambassador, as well as other officers in the embassy and the German military in Tokyo. And he does this largely through drinking sessions and chumming. He becomes a bit notorious for his drinking abilities and stamina. As well, he's building a small network of agents to get about Japan, to speak with other Japanese, to attempt to ferret out some amount of military information. And some of this is successful, some not. His weakest link, aside from his sometimes outlandish behavior for a foreigner who is under constant search and surveillance, is his radio operator. The Japanese intelligence community is alive to the idea of legal radio transmitters, and it will be Zorga's eventual downfall. When this one, I can't remember his name, who is largely confined to his home due to illness, Sorga insists he keeps broadcasting and making reports to Moscow anyway, and eventually the Japanese take note of it and figure it out. While all this is going on, he does not neglect the ladies, along with several German women, including the ambassador's wife, and I think Eugenot's wife too, and some other traveling performer that was a pianist that was there in the embassy. He also seduces, and I kind of mean this in a grooming sort of way, a young unmarried Japanese woman fascinated by foreign music and culture and foreigners themselves. Meanwhile, his wife back in the Soviet Union has a miscarriage, and well, Sorga's not too concerned with all that, with her feelings or for the lost child, so you really can't say he's any kind of sympathetic figure. His high wire act begins to take a toll on him, and as the months pass, Moscow refuses to recall him, though they don't ultimately trust his work or the info he's getting, which is high-grade material due to his close connection to the important folks in the embassy, and in one case, information from one of his sub-agents. His drinking excesses lead to both a motorcycle crash, while he has stolen embassy papers on him, which shows his growing carelessness, and flipping a car completely upside down, which draws the attention of the police yet again. This all leads up to the golden moment when he secures absolutely reliable information that the Germans are going to invade the Soviet Union in June of 1941, a cable he sent on the 20th of that month. And according to Matthews, this was not the only spy telling Stalin this. Stalin wasn't having it, of course. And the infamous quote attributed to Stalin upon reading the Sorga report is, of course, you can tell him to go fuck his mother. Well, according to Matthews, this backlash was actually directed at an agent within the German Air Ministry, codenamed Starshina, and the Stalin quote is, "You can your source from the HQ of German aviation to his fucking mother." That's quite a difference, although you can understand how it became garbled over time. It certainly sounds like a better Stalin story if it's directed at Sorga. The radio man gets discovered, and the ring falls apart quickly from there, with Sorga arrested and not really denying the charges. Being a German, he's treated rather blandly by the Kempetai, and very little of the rough stuff is thrown at him. But sobered up at last, and knowing he faces very well, with no hope of mediation by the Soviets, because Stalin never deigned to intervene or ask for his repatriation, he eventually starts singing a song. Only one person in the ring will make it out of captivity alive by lying and lying and lying consistently. A couple of these unfortunate wives also escaped the scaffold. Sorga was eventually hanged in 1944 at the age of 49, cremated and buried. Later on, his body is dug up, and his Japanese mistress makes a ring from the gold plate that was in his skull that had been used to repair a war wound from the Great War. A hero of the Soviet Union, post-war that is, and there is a mural to him in his birthplace at Baku, and a Soviet era stamp that was issued, which I recently got off eBay. Couldn't help myself. Matthews is pretty solid and thorough, nothing flashy. There are, I'd say, perhaps a few journeys of the speculative here and there. Nothing odd in the biography of a spy. Their every last move and word is seldom known, but also some speculations about wider events like the origins of the Battle of Nemahan that I felt were really hanging out there on the edge of reliability. All in all, a solid 3 on my awesomeness gauge. That's An Impeccable Spy by Owen Matthews. Next up, From Emperor to Citizen by Henry Puyi. This is from 1988, 488 pages. So, first, just the basics on this guy. He's born in 1906, and at the age of 2, he's chosen by the Dowager Empress to be the new emperor of China upon the death of an uncle. He's snatched from his parents and taken to the Forbidden City with his wet nurse and nobody else. Privileged beyond any Western concept of the idea, he is, of course, in reality, not just a prisoner. His various accessions to the throne and throne being yanked away from him are a yo-yo that dominates his young life, a life that is abnormal in nearly every way. Served by eunuchs who must obey his whims in nearly every instance, he once kills one of them by commanding that eunuch to eat mud. His mother he talks into suicide over a violation of household protocol that was apparently taken with deadly seriousness. She overdoses on opium. His father is allowed to visit his schoolroom twice a month for 20 minutes at a time to check on his studies, but there is no touching or real family interaction between them. His wet nurse stays on for 8 years until she was abruptly dismissed. She had escaped death when her family was flooded out of their home, and her father, carrying the baby in a basket, put it down several times at the side of the road but couldn't quite make himself walk away. Later, he tried to sell her in Beijing, but there were no takers. She survived to adulthood to marry and have a daughter herself, but was selected for imperial service because she can produce milk and must leave her daughter behind. When she is abruptly dismissed and returns home, of course, her daughter has died. Henry had a Scottish tutor who opened up his mind to broader subjects, informing him about the white man's strange world in Europe and the Great War, the British Empire, and how gentlemen dressed properly. Along with this, there was chemistry and physics. He takes the Western name of Henry as a Westernization practice, a custom that was often repeated in British African colonies. A child would have a traditional name and take a British Christian name as well. Nothing unusual there. As he grows up, he becomes quite the political showpiece without appearing to have any real idea of what's going on. Take him out the Japanese when booted from the Forbidden City. They put him up in a palace that was actually a former amusement park in Tientsin. He seems to think this is a grand place and it's an upgrade because there are flush toilets. He spends ungodly amounts of money on jewelry and clothing, anything that wanders past his eyes, even though he passively understands its useless acquisition. Sounds to me he just needed something to do, and that was the thing that was allowed for him to do was just go buy stuff, whatever. The Japanese have something in my firm, of course, and they wine and dine him, it might be said, and they even grant him an audience or two with the emperor before setting him up as Emperor of Manchukuo, or at least that's how it starts out. How it ends up is the Japanese make him chief executive, and his title is Your Excellency, not my emperor, and he does not rule by the mandate of heaven, but by the invitation of the people, all which sounds very ludicrous to Puyi. Although already casually cruel as a boy, having tormented the household units because there were no consequences and no discipline, as time passes and both the war in China and the Pacific War go awry for the Japanese Empire, it's fairly clear to me from Henry's writing that he's going a bit batty in his gilded cage, where he makes no decisions the Japanese won't reverse and has no freedom of travel and no privacy from Japanese surveillance. And there's even a plot to murder one of his wives in order to induce him to marry a Japanese woman. He ends up beating servants, and he says torturing them, though he's not specific. His nephews, too. They were young kids hired as pages for his palace from an orphanage, given bad food and shoddy clothing, and forced to work in the palace some 16 hours a day, and they would be beaten and caged at night so they couldn't run away. Those who lived were stunted in growth at war's end. When he really loses his mind, he begins kowtowing to his morning eggs and observing dozens of superstitions. His wife goes a bit mad along with him. He chose to be a vegetarian but couldn't kick the craving for eggs, so by kowtowing to them, he was apologizing for eating them. Captured by the Soviets as a possible political tool in post-war China, he does 5 years in a cushy gulag before he's sent back to the tender mercies of the new communist China. He's got very little to say about the Soviet Union. Surprisingly, perhaps understandable caution on his part. It's a tough situation. His rehabilitation in China takes up a good chunk of this memoir, and his brainwashing feels like a different sort than the Soviets used, involving huge amounts of guilt over tiny infractions and endless homilies and parables to drive home the communist way. Eventually, he is said to have made progress in a shamelessly cynical manner and is brought towards release from prison despite his former crimes because he has confessed and made honest progress in understanding the new China, even though he will never be off the leash entirely, of course. He is eventually given a job doing some gardening work and given permission to write his memoir. He dies in 1967 of cancer. This is a truly insane memoir of a man who lived a completely regulated and useless life, inflicted pain and torture and sometimes death in an unconcerned, detached manner that you'll have some kind of sympathy for despite all that, no matter how far off the charts this guy is morally. Nearly forgotten now, I've run across his name in histories of the Pacific War and Max Hastings' casual mention of him finishing his days as a gardener put the seeds in my mind to seek out some more info on him, and this memoir certainly does that. It made me ask, and I certainly can't tell you the answer, how much is real and how much is Memorex due to the supervision and editing/revision/censoring of his written memoir before it got to press. Regardless, it's a fascinating horror show that you just can't take your eyes off of. There is a film called The Last Emperor from '87 I tried to watch last year, but the copy I got was a horrible VHS port straight to DVD that was just garbage. I mean, the screen image was like this big on my giant 42-inch TV, so I couldn't even do it. I may have tried another time. If you're wandering around the Far East and portion of the Second World War and you're looking for something really different from Western battle histories or Western memoirs, biographies, look no further. You've found your destination. A solid 5 on my awesomeness meter. That's From Emperor to Citizen by Henry Puyi. All right, and then we'll finish up today with Tojo by Peter Malk from 2026, 512 pages, main body. Hot off the press, this one. I don't normally get riled up about pre-releases, but I added this one to my wish list immediately and bought it the week of audio release. Peter Malk says in his intro, this is the first Tojo bio published in English since '61, which is really amazing considering that he's the #1 villain on the Japanese military roster for the Second World War, except no substitutes. He says '61, but as a sidebar, a buddy of mine has a memoir in English from '67. I don't know whether it was already a reprint or whether that's the original date, but take that into consideration. The bigwigs in the Japanese government just don't have the pizzazz or notoriety of the Germans, and I've just never gone down this path before. So it's really new to me and involves learning a whole lot of new names to figure out who they are and what the importance is in the early stages of the book, because I got absolutely no idea and I struggle with it. The writing is dense, and the pace is studied, shall we say. Malk is a thorough and unhurried writer, meticulous without being pretentious, although there are many, many instances of the insulting, dumbing down phrase, in other words, which is the bane of many an author convinced of the lack of education in his audience. There are also many recaps at the end of chapters as a reminder. Normally this kind of hand-holding would drive me bonkers, but in this particular case, I'll admit some hand-holding is in order to keep matters clear in my head. When I say the writing is dense, I mean tree trunk dense. While much of his early life is disposed of in fairly short order, and even his early days in the Army as a junior officer aren't poured over in any great detail, by the time he's given command of a political office in Manchukuo in the 30s, and the subjects are telescoped out to fine detail and careful consideration, it quickly becomes clear that Tojo is really a bureaucrat of the most meticulous paper shuffling sort, with the core idea of forcing obedience of his decrees and decisions, one way or another, to anyone who was subordinate and sometimes of nominally equal rank with him. He was not averse to using the Kempe Tai against rivals in China when the situation seemed to call for it, and he certainly had no notion that a democratic government was any sort of good thing. Typical military man, right? A natural conspirator with officers of a like mind in the 20s and 30s. Apparently this was a common thing. They formed societies with secret agendas and implemented them to get the men they most desired into the correct positions to be amenable to their long-term goal in the Japanese army. His only troop command was of a showpiece regiment in the early portion of his career. Troop command was of a necessity if he was to rise to high ministerial rank, and he was actually regarded as a kind commanding officer who gave a damn about his enlisted men, which is surely a trait that had to stick out like a sore thumb in that army. His subordinate officers, however, took the brunt of his wrath in the regiment for any sort of failing, and he was relentless in punishments for those who failed. This is all of a spit and polish kind of regiment, and of course, it was not meant for combat. It's just parade ground stuff. The China appointment put him in the big leagues with questions of administration of a conquered territory, its policing, its fiscal policy, its railroad policy, because that railroad going through Manchuria was a big deal. It was a big, huge revenue gainer for the Japanese government. And along with the political power was his control of the Kempe Tai, although military matters were not under his control, which could lead to some arguments with those officers who were, of course. He had avoided scandal associated with the several attempts at ill-thought-out coups against the civilian government in the 20s and 30s, although he seems to have sympathized with their aims to a degree. He did not think civilian control of government was legitimate, no matter what the Meiji Constitution said, and his preferred government would be direct rule by the emperor, which was not allowed under that constitution. He schemed and he plotted, but he would never contravene a direct order from Hirohito, who disliked him intensely from the get-go and did not want to rise to army minister at all. And yet, having gained that position and kept it, Hirohito was unable to maneuver him out of it except by change of cabinets, certainly a common enough event in Japanese politics. The issue was that when the cabinet of Kanoe fell, the emperor of all people felt the proper choice for new prime minister was Tojo. Whether this was practicality or an attempt to control Tojo or to compromise him, Malk doesn't really say. Malk is a really truly neutral biographer, too neutral and far too distant. We don't get to know Tojo at all as a human, and his wife is hardly mentioned. Only the legacy of his forcibly retired father, a lieutenant general, is given as key motivation for his life's direction and his passionate hatreds. But the man, no matter how central to the government and the war he was, just doesn't come through as anything but a note on a memo. It's not a he went here and did this and then he went there and did that kind of bio, far from it. It's a bloodless policy after policy after policy biography, and if you're not into that style, just steer clear. There's no break from the endless considerations involving the China incident and how to end it. The Gavin conflict with the West, the alliance with the Axis, and the dreaded tripartite pact. The northern expansion versus the southern expansion options that starts out as kind of subsidiary had me thinking he was going to skip it, but far from it, my friends, far from it. I have to say, though, it's the most meticulous recounting of that debate I've ever seen, which is always mentioned in Western histories but never given this much space to have explained. It still comes down to this grave delusion the Army had that somehow they could defeat the Soviets in a slugging match and take Siberia in a snap. This delusion seems to have been a hangover from Japan's occupation during the intervention in Soviet Russia after the Great War and had nothing to do with reality. Reality came in the form of border disputes of the 30s, which Malk goes through at good length, except for the biggie, Namahan. And I can't understand how he left that out. That's not just a border dispute, it's a full-on mini-war that lasts a few months. Tojo is Vice Minister of War at this time, and surely it had to concern him. There's just no mention of it at all, and I don't understand that. How can you not have Namahan in there? It's a big deal. This North versus South debate is followed by a lead up to the war in the Pacific and the endless debates over diplomacy with the U.S. Britain never seems to have ever really counted in their considerations, and only the U.S. gave a real damn about the Japanese getting control of the entire country of China. But it's related strictly from Tojo's position and the Tokyo viewpoint, so no worries over the nitty-gritty of the Washington sessions between Hull, Nomura, and Kurusu. Tojo is so deeply buried in Army affairs he has virtually no understanding of what the Navy does or its capabilities. He's not briefed on them either, which is odd considering the Navy's portion of responsibility for making the drive to the south is overwhelming, and Tojo surely needs to know a thing or two about the operation to understand its implications for his action as Prime Minister. That he knew nothing of Pearl Harbor is understood from its super-secret status and the tight lid the Navy kept on its existence from anyone outside the Navy they didn't absolutely have to bring into the picture, such as the torpedo manufacturer, for instance, let's say. But his reaction to being told of the Pearl Harbor plan is total disregard. Okay, sounds great, hope it works out, have a good time. Good for you, bro. That's a stunner. He's really worried about that trying to convince Hirohito to go to war was a huge stumbling block. The Navy won't commit to saying whether or not they can win a war against Uncle Sam, only that they can fight well for a while. The two admirals who are in the way he dispenses with after some shenanigans, but the replacements aren't all that gung-ho about it either. You think from this recalcitrance that when he gets told about Pearl Harbor, it might spark some deeper questions in him to be asked, but no, he stays in his lane. Albeit his lane is kind of weird at this moment because he's not only the Prime Minister, he's also still Army Minister. And he devises a point not to let the two offices overlap. So get this, he determines that in his mind it's possible for the Army Minister not to know anything that only the Prime Minister knows, and vice versa, so that he doesn't overstep either sphere of authority. One won't tell the other part of his personality what the other part of the personality is doing, in effect. This is nuts. Just plain nuts. A rare instance of getting at the man Tojo is given here, and another such moment when he travels about Tokyo, he has started checking people's trash bins to search what they throw away, and to determine if the populace is getting enough to eat. Also nuts, but not commented at all by Malk. That's just like what he did on Tuesday. Cool. The author says that this is the first bio in English of Tojo since '61. He sets out his parameters in the intro, stating it is not the intention to paint him as a monster or criminal, but as a decision maker and informer of policy of Japan, and that he succeeds in doing. It's a dense work here, bureaucratic infighting and back and forth trying to reach consensus, which was a necessity in Japan's government. It is an interesting contrast with Nazi Germany and their shotgun approach to governance by decree and one minister at a time. No Reichstag necessary, thank you very much. And for the most part, the Japanese Diet is not painted as necessary, though it was a functioning body. They actually had a real government. While Malk is primarily and exhaustively concerned with the military decisions and choosing war and which war they wanted to fight and why, this does neglect almost entirely anything as Prime Minister Tojo had to deal with concerning the legislative body. It's just one blind spot among many. Tojo is painted as a soulless bureaucrat without any personality or private life, without joys or sorrows, just ambition and devotion to the job and the emperor. And so with these huge gaps in his life not illuminated, there are events that are entirely unremarked upon that you would think ought to be mentioned because they are kind of meaningful events in Japan's war history, such as the Raven Night King, the border war in Namahan, so on and so forth, Shanghai. But no matter if he had direct responsibility for these events at the time, and he didn't, they're still watershed events and need to be worked into a bio on Tojo, not just ignored. The war years are fairly interesting, but still entirely bloodless in this author's telling. Tojo's seeming indifference to kamikaze tactics and absolute silence on matters of forced labor and the military's treatment of POWs and foreign internees is just ridiculous. Likewise, his trial, where the scanty coverage leaves you a bit concerned as to what exactly his crimes against humanity were. Malk is only concerned with crimes against peace and a bit with conspiring to wage aggressive war. He is very concerned to show us how Tojo got the better of the prosecution in cross-examination, but he leaves out the rest. And that's a blatant attempt to wipe the slate clean. Tojo was the most identifiable villain in Japanese hierarchy to Americans, Brits, Dutch, Burmese, Malaysians, Australians, so on and so forth. And thus it's foolish to sketch such a bare-bones portrait of what he was and convicted and hung for. Well, I'm glad to have finally got something on Tojo, and a contemporary bio at that. It's very much hit and miss despite the length of the study, and certainly it's not a one-size-fits-all scholarly effort. Malk bent over backwards and twisted himself to a pretzel to present Tojo as just another politician in troubled times, doing his bestest to steer his nation to victory. 3 stars on the awesomeness meter just because, but really 1 star because of all that is left out. And that will wrap things up for this session of the Far East from 3 very different perspectives: the spy, the puppet, and the razor. Razor, by the way, was Tojo's first nickname, given to him for his incisive mind. Later on, he was given the name Lightning Strike Minister because his aircraft was once struck by lightning on his way back to Tokyo. Kind of silly. I certainly hope one or more of these titles has tempted you into exploring their twisted roads and alleys. I'm Admiral Nagumo, and I've just sent my last message to Imperial General Headquarters from my post in Saipan, where things are not going as well as I imagined they would, and I think you all know what that means. Banzai! And until next time, happy reading.